Welcome to episode 37 of Rubbish Talk with myself, Alistair Meldrum.
And myself, Jane Bond.
And today we have finally after a bit of, not persuasion, but just trying to get diaries aligned, we have John Ferguson from the Binn Group. Before we go into that, a little bit of news as usual from myself and Jane. So first one I picked up was there's a thought, a theory, a rumour going around the Conservative government is going to break its environmental promise about banning peat. So this has been in the cards for a long time that the UK was going to ban the sale of peat and try and encourage people to use, more compost type things. And obviously peat's a big carbon store. So the idea is by using peat, we're damaging the country's carbon store. And it looks like we're going to back off that again, which has been an ongoing issue, which seems a bit disappointing that, something relatively simple could be put in place. But
yeah, especially as we're making all this compost from all these food waste collections.
We'll wait and see if it does happen. But I think you're going high tech, Jane. I think you're going for AI or something.
I am actually. I was actually reading this, quite impressed actually. Amazing what you can do with AI, which is slightly worrying as well. Is a London-based recycling tech business called Sorted, which has raised £1.6 million in seed funding to try and enable pickers on the sorting lines to try and actually recover the materials better, using computer vision, spectroscopy and coloured lasers driven by AI, and trying to pinpoint valuable items on recycling lines. I'm just wondering what these valuable items are, whether they're watches or money or, or whatever. But do you know what would be even better if they wouldn't have human pickers in the first place? So, whether they can actually develop that even a bit further to take away the human element of it, perhaps. I don't know.
Absolutely. No, it'll be interesting. We'll share the link with that one. It was quite an interesting article. The next one that caught my eye was a report about bin lorry fires being up by 70% since 2022. So this is bin fires have gone up to 1,200 fires. Previously, it was about 700 fires a year. So that's a huge amount of fires every year across the UK, isn't it?
It is a lot, isn't it?
And bear in mind, one of these bin lorries is, I don't know what they're worth. They're certainly, lots, tens of thousands of pounds. 90, 100,000 pound per vehicle. So it's a lot of vehicle to damage. And that was work done by Material Focus. And for listeners that have not listened before, Scott Butler from Material Focus was on the podcast episode 15, if you've not listened to it before. And he talked about, the issue of batteries, the issue of waste electronics, and this disposable tech culture we seem to be sleepwalking in, which is partly driving this increase. So I think their figures 1.1 billion electrical items containing lithium-ion batteries, which is just enormous.
And it's those things that you don't think of, like these these little electrical toothbrushes that you get. You just buy them £8 or whatever, and then you throw them away at the end. But how, it's like, well, how do you get the batteries out? Where do you put them? Or, it's all of these types of things, isn't it? Back to producers trying to, if they could make things that was easily dismantleable, is that a word? Anyway, it would be quite handy, and they wouldn't be dumped.
Yeah, you do wonder how we're going to sort it out, that we're putting more and more of this material on the market and it's causing more and more fires. What's the answer? The best will in the world is we'll never get everybody in the system to put them where they should.
Well, perhaps what we need to do is get AI so that when you chuck things in the bin lorry, AI will automatically pick them all up and say, stop, fire, something like that. Or is that just taking a theme too far?
I think that take it to stretching the science a little bit too far there, I think, Jane.
Right, okay, fair enough. The other one I've got is Environment Agency. There's a dump site or an illegal waste site in Kent, and it's massive. Have a look at this site, and it's been going on for months and months by the looks of things. And it's a really nice sounding name, Raspberry Hill Park Farm, Iwade in Kent, near Sittingbourne. And you just think, I mean, if it's been there for such a long time, fortunately they're closing it down now, but you look at how much they're missing out in landfill tax. If we're looking at about £103.70 in landfill tax just now, and then going up to, per tonne, going up to £126.15 from the 1st of April 2025. Can you imagine how much the HMRC are missing out on landfill tax there?
It was a BBC report that they'd obviously put the drone up and so on, and the site appeared to still be operating. So seemingly Kent Council, HMRC, the Environment Agency are all aware. And the mad thing is, the site seems to still be functioning, and for whatever reason, they can't seem to close it down. And the fact there was so much stuff going in that everybody in that area must know.
Everybody knew.
They must know where it's going. I think I put a bit of a LinkedIn post up about it, and my comment at one point was they've got to start seizing the vehicles. If vehicles are going in there and it's an illegal operation, start seizing the vehicles, and then it would stop.
I mean, in terms of duty of care, they're breaching everything they can possibly think about. I mean, I keep hounding on about this, and I probably said it a few times before, but it kind of that BBC Disclosure Scotland about SEPA's offices at work in the waste crime sites, and I just found that quite fascinating. And I think it was 2022, I think January 2022, and one of the largest fly tipping sites in Scotland was found in Lochgelly in Fife. And you just look at this and you just think, God, how can people, not enforce that?
It's difficult.
Yeah, I know. What are we missing?
Yeah. And even more depressingly, Jane, I came back across for anybody that knows Ayrshire, the A70 between Muirkirk and Douglas, which is the route from the M74 to Ayr. And I thought the council had been doing, so it's South Lanarkshire Council, I thought the council had been doing an excellent job litter picking. I was a bit depressed that there seemed to be a full bag about every 20 metres. So it just shows you how much crap is sitting at the side of the road. And I managed to, Alison was with me, and we took a video of it to show the sort of extent of how much had been picked. And I put it up on social media, and it turns out it was not South Lanarkshire Council at all. It was a local volunteer who has been picking the side of this main road. And it's just, when you see it sitting in bags there, you just think, how much stuff is just discarded out of car windows. And, how have we got to that position where everybody just chucks crap out the window? And not everybody, obviously, but there must be a pretty big portion of the population that actually do just chuck the crap out the window.
Yeah. Yeah. Did I tell you about my holiday recently at Ulster?
You've not been flying again, Jane, have you?
No, but I was cycling while I was there. But we did cycle along a lot of roads, and some of them were quite busy roads because they've got little cycle tracks at the side of them. And I did notice there was very little litter on the side of the roads, streets as well.
Whereas if you cycle around Scotland, you notice there is a huge amount of litter.
Yeah.
And George Nibloch did reply to my post, and he quite rightly pointed out that local authorities and the national trunk companies have a legal responsibility to actually pick the litter at the side of the road, and they're actually failing in their duty to do so. So his point is, the people with the legal responsibility need to step up, and maybe if they started having to do the work or doing the work, they would maybe be a bit more vocal about trying to enforce some sort of litter fines and try and get some proper engagement with the public, just to highlight how unacceptable it maybe is, but
Mm.
it is pretty depressing when you see the amount of stuff at the side of the road like that, and that's multiplied across the UK or across Scotland.
Crikey, we're a bit of doom and gloom today,
Oh,
Alistair,
certainly are,
aren't we? Blimey. Blimey. Right, so and on some lighter notes, not lighter, but Albion news, we've got our upcoming training courses. We've got an asbestos awareness one that's coming up. So anybody who deals with asbestos, comes into contact with asbestos, obviously there's major health and safety issues with asbestos. So it's looking at how we manage it, how we deal with it, what the regulations are, what the legislation is, and that kind of stuff. And we've also got one for household waste recycling centres. And staff on household recycling centres, we're trying to focus perhaps on the supervisors and stuff like that, as often you get the operators who are actually operating the site, and they'll say, oh, well, why don't you tell our supervisor that? So we're going for the supervisors, aren't we, Alistair?
Yeah. And we're also trying to update that one, or we are in the process of updating that one to cover WUDs and POPs. So what is it? Waste, upholstered domestic seating, and persistent organic pollutants. So we're trying to update it for that. So we will be putting a bit of social media out about that. So lastly, before we pass over to John, we would love some feedback to our AI generated song that was at the end of last episode, and I think Mia's going to put it at the end of this episode. So if you've got any feedback for us, whether you liked it or hated it, or think we shouldn't have shared at the end, please let us know. And also, if you get any feedback about the podcast, as anybody doing these things, we would love a review, a wee update, a share, or a follow, or whatever you feel obliged to do. So next over to John Ferguson, and we had a fascinating. So we were probably quite depressing there, Jane, but I think we had a very optimistic and upbeat chat with John about all his plans and all the plans he's involved with, and how we can really make a difference in terms of the waste sector, in terms of plastic and carbon and so on. So we had a pretty fascinating conversation with John. And just for once, it was quite long. So if you're planning your run, you might need to run a few extra miles.
Yeah, absolutely. We put the will to rights, didn't we, Alistair, though?
If you want to listen to it in one go, you might need to run or walk a bit further than you usually do. So I think that's us. Over to myself, Jane, and John Ferguson.
Hi, John. How are you doing? Nice
Hello,
to speak to you after such a long time.
Yeah, it's far too long in between the times, Jane, I have to say. And this whole sector's full of people that I'm so fond of and see far too little of, I have to say. And that includes a lot of ex-SEPA colleagues.
Yeah, I was thinking, I can't remember what conference it was a CIWM spring meeting the other day. And it was, yeah, it was just really nice just catching up with people in real life.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, so
and, we don't always get to the same conferences as well. There's a lot of pressure on time these days.
Yes, that's the other thing, isn't it? Yeah, what we should do is just coordinate and say, right, okay, I'm going to that one. No, right, I'll meet you there. Cup of tea. So we're going to ask you 20 questions, and feel free to ask us questions as well. You know, we're quite happy to chat about anything and everything. So the first question.
John's probably panicking here because his list only got 11 questions, but.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you know,
that'll be 5, Alistair. Oh, there's another page.
It was a what do you call it? A figure of speech.
Yep.
So anyway, mastermind. I suppose we're talking about you, really. Can you tell us who you currently work for and a bit of background about what you're doing and how you're managing your work time at the moment?
Oh, Jane, I work for the Binn Group, and I'm head of strategy in the Eco Park. And I went there actually at the behest of John McGregor, 15 years ago. John, will you come and do our energy from waste plant for us? And you'll recall the days of, way back when the people were doing the waste strategy. We had a very particular perspective on incineration, that we needed it. We didn't want too much of it, but we wanted it to do the best job it could possibly do, which meant that we put the right facilities in the right places. And of course, as is the way of things, that in our general failure to operationalize policy across so many areas of environmental things over the last 20 years, certainly 25 years, we failed kind of to do that. And we've ended up with lots of big incinerators, largely often in the wrong places, and waste traveling ridiculous distances because of, a failure to have a sensible procurement system. So I was asked to do the energy from waste plant, and it actually took about 14 years. We closed it last year, and we started construction at the beginning of this year, and we had our first stone laying ceremony a week past Monday.
I saw that, John.
Wow.
I saw that.
Yeah, and that was actually the fruit of 14 years. And I would have always said, energy from waste plants, complex projects. I mean, 7-8 years at least. I did not expect it to be 14 years. But we have ended up with a relatively small incinerator embedded in a location that can and wants to use all of its energy, its heat and its power, with ideas as to how to decarbonize it. So, I guess it maybe thrown nature saying, well, you failed to do this the way I think you should have done it, and this is how you should have done it. So people will at some point come up to the bin and go, actually, this is the kind of small scale, reasonably decentralized, it's dealing with the local authorities' waste, and it's dealing with this company's waste, and it's not moving waste from the northeast of Scotland to the very south, to the northwest of Scotland to the very southeast of Scotland. That's how I started with the bin. And around that, the kind of agreement was, I'll do your incinerator, but we need to do it the right way, and we need to build an ecosystem around it. And the Eco Park is that ecosystem. And we're currently just doing the master plan consent under the new Scottish 2019 Scottish planning regulations. And that will allow us to have a significantly scaled up zone of approved purposes that are in effect given outline planning permission. And the basic thesis of the Eco Park is to bring clean technology, low carbon transitional technologies around the area of circular materials, controlled environment agriculture, and it's based around the gravitational pull of our own energy ecosystem, so we can offer low cost peer-to-peer heat and power, and the heat comes from the incinerator. We intend to try and decarbonize that. And I can go into that a bit later on. But that's what I'm doing at the bin. It's a pretty medium scale SME, a successful waste and skip company. It's got some really great people working for it. And I think it's a growth company for the future. And it's just been interesting to be part of that journey with them, but to, do the bits around the edges of what can be done through industrial symbiosis. And industrial ecology by building around themes like waste management. What else can you do?
It's certainly developed, hasn't it, John, from a skip company into this sort of I was going to say all singing, all dancing, but not quite, not yet. We're still working on that. But, all these different ideas and opportunities for the Eco Park and the energy from waste and the plastics project you're working on as well.
It has. It's got a lot of opportunity, Jane, for diversification. And I think that one of the big challenges the sector has, and we see this in some of the conferences, we go to some of the big Scottish conferences, and you very much get a policy discussion audience. You look around, you think, well, where are the operators? Where are the companies that are out there running fleets and logistics and doing the separation of materials and the packaging of the materials and the marketing of the materials? And I'm thinking there's got to be a better connection between the operational and the policy side of the sector, and between the sectors, between the public, private, and the third sector, because all of these sectors have a key role to play. And I think the failure to operationalize policy is in part because of that disconnect. The operators just get on and do the day-to-day job because it's a busy job, and it needs to be done every day, or before we know it, we're piling up waste in the streets and we've got all sorts of problems. And the policy people get busy behind their desks, and they're well-intentioned. They're doing lots of good policy work and research work and publishing reports. But somehow the two things are not connecting, not getting that journey of policy into practice, that operationalization of policy. And we have got to get that right. We don't have time for I see too many reports, too much research. I'm thinking, don't need to know that, don't want to know that. We know enough of this to do this, so let's just do this. Can we just do this?
Do you think it's like, I mean, we do, we're great at policy, we're great at writing reports and strategies and things like that, but actually then putting into operation is a totally different environment and a totally different thing. Do you think it's kind of just because it's that decision making that's needed to push it from a strategy into an operational? Is it money? Is it actually making the decision to say this is the way we're going, rather than, you know, saying, oh no, we're going to do this, oh no, we've just had something else, something, you know, something more shiny coming along, we'll do that instead? What do you think?
I think it's, in terms of timetable, it's often set by the never-ending cycle of political change, and that's democracy. You know, governments come and governments go, and governments change priorities and change tack and change direction. So for people who are in operational environments, for example, 14 years to develop an energy from waste plant, our wind farm, we put in 6 years or 5 years of work, and the government suddenly changed the renewable obligation certificate environment, and that sunk. That was 5 years and about £500,000 of sunk cost, completely lost. We were sharp enough to find a way of fixing that and still get our wind farm. So the political cycles tend to create pretty short activity frameworks. You know, you've got to do things quite quickly because you're not going to get 10 years to do this. And people turn over very quickly. So, you know, they're not necessarily following through. They're not there long enough to go, okay, I've got to finish this job. I can't move on until I've got this to completion. And I think there's many parts to why we don't operationalize policy very well. Another part, perhaps, is we don't start the conversation about policy in the right place. You know, we should have cross-sectoral, 365 degrees discussions about, what do you think we need policy on? And if you start that discussion in the right place, in a cross-sectoral discussion, and then once you identify the things that you agree are the areas that need policy developed, then you go into the places that are good at developing policy, which is, you know, government executives and agencies like SEPA and like Zero Waste Scotland. But throughout that journey of developing the policy, you keep the conversation going. And that conversation is with the people that are going to have to pick that policy up and make it happen on the ground. It may be investments in new technologies, it may be training, it may be education, behaviour change, whatever it is. But at the end of the day, you want an outcome. You want to see benefits. Benefits management early on in the thinking of policy is a really good thing to do, because you go, what is the benefit we want from here? If you're always looking at the benefits, then you've got to deliver your policy to get the benefit. And I don't think we do that. We don't follow that through. We don't connect that. We don't connect it early enough with the right audience. You know, people are like neural networks. If you get the right neural network, it's like the brain is working properly. That will be a different network for one thing and a different network for another thing. But the point is, it's all the right nodes firing in the right way at the right time.
I always think, John, that we're not very good at, we put in policy and then almost forget about it, rather than trying to make the policy work to the best, to sort of optimize it. You know,
absolutely.
There's so many things we do that are fairly poor, that we, you know, rather than thinking a new policy, we should actually be looking at trying to make it work a bit better.
Also, I think that is a classic example. I'll give you a classic example of how correct you are when you say that. If you take the landfill tax, for all the policies, all the strategies, all of the reports, all the research that we've ever done, the thing that changed behaviour more than anything was going, we're going to make landfill really not cheap. And by about 2008, the tipping point had been reached where people were going, this is too painful to landfill, so let's do something else. And that opened up a whole range of other opportunities and drivers to change behaviour, including waste crime, incidentally. But putting that aside, it changed behaviour. What we needed to do with the landfill tax was go, this is working really well. What else can we do? You know, I had a conversation recently with HMRC, and I've not really started it with Revenue Scotland, but I need to, about plastic and residual waste. Now, in the landfill ban implementation date is 2025. We're making that transition from landfill to incineration. And many people don't like that, but they perhaps don't realise just how strictly controlled incineration is and how the emission limits have got tighter and tighter over time. And it is a net reduction in carbon from landfill, very substantively. Nor do you have the massive water emissions that landfill creates. So landfill was the worst of all things. So we had to move somewhere, and we looked at it very carefully, and the only really reliable evidence system at the moment is incineration. What they didn't say was there's a net reduction in carbon, but actually there's a net increase in non-biogenic carbon because you're not landfilling plastic, you're now burning it. So I'm thinking the landfill tax regime should be going, okay, well, because I've been and spoken and said, look, we're developing this project in Tayside. It sits alongside incinerators. We reckon we could sit and take the significant amount of the non-biogenic carbon impact out of 2 or 3 incinerators. And if you peppered these around the place, you'd have these advanced plastic separating and upcycling factories. You'd be taking out pretty much all the residual, the stuff that we haven't cherry picked that we want in that kind of 15% that we're actually recycling. You'd have taken out all the other plastic or most of it, and you'd have recovered some more good recyclate. You'd have created feedstock security for the depolymerization sector to go into chemistry. You'd have put some of it into, we've got a clever technology called polymer fusion molding, which is really versatile in using all sorts of kinds of plastics in different qualities to make very high spec, very high quality building materials. But you're always going to have a bit of stuff you can't do anything with. So the discussion with HMRC and in due course with Revenue Scotland will be, we need a secure environment to put this plastic, which is inventoried, we know what's there, it's geolocated, we know where it is, it's in a dry cell landfill, it's creating no pollution. And when you want to recover it in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, or 100 years, you lift the lid and there it is. And you've conserved the resource, but you've given it a safe place in the interim. And you've not burnt it and stuck it up in the sky. And so there's an example of a policy area that's been highly successful, that could have been evolved, should be evolved. And there was other arguments for other mid-range tax bands to do other things with construction and demolition waste, as you know very well.
Very interesting. I've not actually thought of it like that before. Let's have our landfill as a storage unit rather than I guess it depends whether people would actually go back in 10 years' time and dig it up and do something with it. I suppose that's the ultimate test, isn't it, really?
If you look at the evolution in material technologies and, for example, the development of biological solutions to polymer waste and enzymatic digestion, and etc., then it's a rapidly evolving field. Hydrocarbons are a resource that have multiple uses. And I think future generations would thank us, perhaps. Who knows? It might be 200 years in the future. Who knows? But conserving resources rather than creating a problem with them to get rid of them seems to me an eminently sensible choice. If somebody says to you, should we burn this and create climate change, or should we stick it in a safe place and conserve it for future use? 99.9% of people are going to go, that's a no-brainer.
Yeah, I guess in effect you could class all landfills as that. It's all stored. There's metals. There's all sorts of stuff in that landfill site. If we actually dug them all up and mined them, what would we get out of it?
Yes, that is absolutely true. The problem with putting plastics into landfill, however, is that over long periods of time, you will break down the plastic. And when you break down plastic, it becomes microplastic.
Yeah.
And it gets out into the leachate and out into the environment. And, you've seen, I think we've just published a paper in the Institute of Materials Mining and Metals.
We shared it for you, John. We shared it in Rubbish Dog.
You did. Yes. Oh, right. Okay. Thank you.
We failed to send you the link to tell you we did that, but we did.
Well, thank you. Because the whole point of doing that was to say we have to recycle more plastic. But if we recycle more plastic, we're creating the perfect vector for microplastics to enter the marine and any aqueous ecosystem. We have got to tackle this through policy and a better understanding. So our research was around trying to better understand and highlight where we're failing to understand what micro and nanoplastics are produced and their behaviors, and how we can improve the capture from the washing systems to make sure they don't get out in the wash water. That as we do a good job by recycling plastics, we're not creating a bigger problem by micronizing plastics and sticking them out into the oceans, because it's just another burden on an ecosystem. I'm quite often concerned about ocean collapse, way ahead of climate change. We're putting such pressure on that ecosystem, and if that starts to tumble, then we're in very serious trouble. And microplastics are not helping.
I've talked a few times in the podcast about, is it Howard Dryden?
Yes.
Do you know Howard?
Yeah.
He posts a lot of stuff on LinkedIn about the condition of the oceans. I know the other one I was thinking there, John, when you were talking, was Erin Brown. I think you know it,
I was
Erin?
just looking. I couldn't remember her name. Erin Brown. She was fascinating. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know she was on. I'll have to go and listen. So
she's
episode 20, John.
Well okay. That's what I was trying to find. I was trying to find the episode number.
So
there.
Erin Brown was the student that came to me, her department. Have you got any good MSc projects? And I proposed a couple. She picked up on the microplastics one, decided to do microplastics for her MSc thesis, and that was one of the reports, the theses that report is based on.
Yeah.
And she then went on to do a PhD in it. She's now working with W.S. Atkins part-time, doing a PhD. Right. And she is my daughter-in-law's sister.
Right, okay, so vague. There's a vague connection there, John. Somewhere.
There is. She's a lovely, and she's a very, very bright young woman. She's a very lovely person.
Yeah, she was fascinating.
She was good. And the thing I remember vividly about her podcast was she lives in Manchester on a canal boat. She took the canal boat down to either Manchester or Birmingham.
The family had one. Yes.
Took it down, and that's where she's currently living. So if people haven't listened to that one, certainly worth a
right. I think she's doing her PhD now in Birmingham.
That's true.
Anyway, what's most encouraging is that they're very quick to pick up on ideas, and honestly, there's some exceptionally bright young people. That gives me hope. It really does.
It's good.
She's certainly one of them.
So taking you back a bit of a step, John, what's been your career journey? How did you get into waste management? Did you plan it, or was it an accident like many?
Oh, goodness me, when you go back and you think from the origin of school, at school I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to do medicine, and at prelim I had all the grades that I needed, and then at the actual exams I dropped a grade, and I just couldn't understand what had happened, and I never managed to really recover from that. That disappointment. It was years later I thought, actually, probably my writing is awful, that my teachers could read my writing, but the examiner couldn't. And I thought, God, just by bad writing, you probably missed on the. But anyway, that's a long time ago. I then went on to study. I actually went out to the rigs. I was quite a late developer, quite immature when I was a kid. So I didn't want to go and study too early. So I went and I worked on oil rigs and lounged about and grew my hair long and probably smoked a bit too much pot, as you do at that age. And eventually,
that's a first for the podcast series, John. A confession about smoking pot.
Well, I'm probably of the old hippie generation. So I worked on oil rigs and cut down trees, and I was young and wild and having a nice time and gardening and looking at birds and drying herbs and doing all sorts of stuff. And eventually I got to the point where thinking, right, I don't want to do this anymore. And I went to study. And when I finished that degree, halfway through the degree, it was the year after Live Aid. It was 1985. We did an event called Fife Aid at Ferguson Country Park, just outside St Andrews. And it was our attempt to keep the kind of message going about, looking after children and not letting them starve to death. And I think around about that time, I really got interested in world agriculture. And because I was studying plant biochemistry, I thought I'll study biochemistry, the plants, and I was fascinated by photosynthesis and just the science of plants and the chemistry of plants. I thought I'll get into world agriculture. And that was kind of my plan after university, was to do that. I subsequently studied at Cranfield a master's in soil and water engineering, because I thought, biochemistry, plants, agronomy, soil, water, it's all kind of connecting. But at the end of the MSc study, we did Fife Aid 2. So I did another year with this charity doing this event. And at the end of it, this was around about 1987 by then, 88. I was so broke, I thought I better go back and earn some money. So I went back out to the rigs, and I worked as a mud engineer, drilling fluids engineer. for nearly 2 years. And it was during that period of time I thought, right, I've got to get on with my career. I don't want to be working on oil rigs. But it was on the oil rigs, seeing the flaring, seeing the pollution in the marine system around the platforms, the benthic zones underneath just being dead zones, the general culture of the oil industry. We're a really special industry. We don't have to worry too much about the environment. That's for the little people. And that was the kind of epiphany for me of becoming an environmentalist. And it was at that point that I started to apply for jobs. I got offered 2 jobs very quickly, one within the water sector and one within the waste sector. And I interviewed for the one in the waste sector was actually Scotland's first externally appointed recycling officer. This is 1990, and it was Perth and Kinross Council. Dundee City Council had an internal candidate that had risen up and been appointed recycling officer, but I was, after that, the first recycling officer. And that started a journey and a fascination with materials and waste. And like many, many people, they just get into it and you go, this is so fundamental. It's fascinating. It's got so many facets. It's absolutely jam-packed with the potential to apply good science, good economics, and good environmental understanding. And I haven't left it really. It's kept me interested, and to this day.
And then how did you end up with SEPA then?
That's
John?
what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Right. I think because it was the serendipity of timing. I think 1990, in 1988, the House of Lords Environment Committee had published a report on Her Majesty's Pollution of Inspector of Pollution, HMIP, and it was excoriating. It was basically saying we are absolutely appalling at preventing pollution. And of course, this was in the 80s. We were known as the dirty man of Europe, and for many good reasons. And it led to the evolution of the Environment Protection Act. And the Environmental Protection Act was an absolute, we talked earlier about the landfill tax being a complete game changer for waste management. The EPA was the game changer for all environmental pollution protection. And eventually out of that grew the need for specialist, non-conflicted agencies. For example, previously, a lot of environmental legislation was done by local authorities who were also, it was the gamekeeper poacher syndrome. They were the landfilling the waste, but regulating their own sites. And that just doesn't work. So, along came the EPA, and eventually along came the idea of agencies. Now, that was 1996 when the EA and SEPA started. In 1993, I was 3 years into my career. There was other people coming in. I think Ian Gulland had just started. Dave Gorman, Duncan Simpson, Nikki. I met Nikki Suter in the early 90s doing her PhD with Scottish Water. Duncan Simpson was appointed up in Aberdeenshire. And there was a whole group of people that came together and said, we really have to get organised. So we set up the Recycling Advisory Group Scotland, and that was the first. It evolved round about the time of LARAC at the same time. And I used to go to the LARAC events, but it was very difficult to get people from Scotland down to LARAC. So we thought we have to get something of our own up here. So I set up.
John, LARAC.
Oh,
you need to describe that.
Might not know what that is.
It's the Local Authority Recycling Advisory Committee. And it exists to this day. It's been a highly successful and effective lobbyist and representative for local authorities. And they needed it, to this day. And we, RAGS did a purpose for quite a few years until other organizations like the Chartered Institute really started to catch up with the kind of recycling message. Certainly Cyber Scotland was a little bit slow in those days, but it did a lot of good work nonetheless. Anyway, along came the legislation that set up SEPA. I had inputted to that legislation. I said, we need an agency that will take on. I noted within the founding legislation that it would be doing waste strategy, and I really supported that idea. And when it got set up, it transferred the waste regulators from local authorities, all of the river purification boards for water pollution and water management, including the hydrology and flooding, and HMIP from the civil service for industrial pollution, all transferred. And it's transferred about 600 staff. And at that point, it was quite interesting to watch local authorities because they were trying to keep a hold of the best people, and so they really managed to kind of fiddle the books a little bit in terms of who transferred. But nonetheless, a lot of good people transferred, but it was still far too small. And I remember very early on, there was the first wave of new recruits, and within that was the post for a policy officer within the waste policy and waste strategy division. And there was no waste strategy at that time. So I took a policy post and very quickly got the post for head of waste strategy and was allowed to build my team from scratch. And we built a team of almost 40 people and published Scotland's first waste strategy in 2003.
So you were the man behind the area waste plans, really, weren't you? That's when I probably remember you from first.
Yes, I mean, I think we were more co-creative, more cross-sectoral than at any time since or before. We genuinely tried to get everybody involved. I think we've failed to do that as effectively as we did in those days of SEPA. Yeah. To this day, I believe it was a mistake to move away from the area waste plans because each area would have had a joint committee. You'd have had faster decision making. You'd have had proximate infrastructures. You'd have had procurement systems much more configured to local solutions, deriving local economic benefit. And I think we'd have had a much quicker, more integrated core resource management system than we have today.
Why did it drift away? I never really worked out why it did. It seemed to sort of fizzle out to a certain extent. Was it just too difficult to get the parties to work together?
No, I think it was. I'd have to be a little bit controversial, but at my age, I will be, and and in no way wishing to offend any current civil servant. The current team of whom are some of the best I've ever seen. At the time, I think the civil service was very gung-ho. We're in charge. We're taking control back from you, SEPA. Get back in your place and be a regulator. And they lost the thread of the issues. They didn't have thematic experience to really understand them. And they basically let it wither. And they got back to just handing out money to local authorities. And that's why we've got still a pretty fragmented system with local authorities doing very different things. And that's not a criticism of local authorities. I think it's more a criticism of the lack of system and strategy around them. And of course, it was associated with things like the first national planning framework. And I had a group of specialist waste planners, the only time Scotland's ever had specialist waste planners. And I think to this day, we miss having these people. The first national planning framework, one of the arguments we had with them was we need, as a piece of national infrastructure, a network of small energy from waste plants that will move us from landfill into small scale, proximate, integrated, properly located energy from waste plants. And they went, oh, we can't do that. I said, well, why can't you do that? It's not a big piece of infrastructure. I said, as a network, it's a massive piece of infrastructure. It does a job. So why can't you? It was just the lack of vision, I think. And again, and that comes back to the lack of ability to see how you're going to operationalize your policy.
I was going to say, I think we've talked about this before, John, and I've certainly mentioned it in the podcast, is just this lack of, the infrastructure, the facilities we've got across the country have changed drastically over the last 20 years. And I don't know any bit of work that sort of sat down and said, right, what have we got where? What have we got for handling compost in the northwest of Scotland? What have we got? There's nothing like that out there at the time. Whereas you go back 20 years, there was that information that was, maybe wasn't perfect, but there was that knowledge of that infrastructure we needed and where the gaps were.
We had a good chat with Colin Clark, John, episode 31, in terms of looking at that waste strategy and stuff. Because when I first came up to Scotland, I started in the Environment Agency and then came up and worked in consultancy. And one of the first things I was doing was meeting up with Colin and looking at the waste strategy for the Highlands area. And we always kind of get together every so often and go, if we'd have done that then, it would have been perfect. Because it was all about local solutions.
Yes, it was. And I think, from my recollection of Colin, there's some blisteringly bright people in this sector, Simon Glenn. Colin's in that group to me. Just intelligent people. I always felt that Colin wasn't supported adequately by his political administrations, because waste was always emotive and and controversial, and nobody wanted to support certain types of solutions like incineration because that was dirty and not green.
Dirty word, wasn't
But
it?
let's think realistically, what were we doing with it? We were landfilling it, which if you want to get dirty, that's about as dirty as you're going to get. Even in spite of the landfill directive and the changes that brought and the good practice of many companies running good tight landfills, they were still pretty polluting infrastructures.
So out of all these roles, John, what's been your favourite? Any particular, or is your current role the favourite?
It would be hard to beat leading the National Waste Strategy team for SEPA, because I got to work with so many good people. And there are people who came into that team early in their careers who are now in very senior positions in SEPA. And I will always hold SEPA with very high regard. I think it's a hugely underfunded organization. It could do so much more, properly resourced, and why at this late stage in dealing with the environmental problems we're underfunding organizations like SEPA. I'm really failing to understand the rationale behind that. And it was such a challenge. And I kind of wish I was doing the job then with what I know now, that I had more experience myself, because I think it would have been a different strategy. But going back to your point about, the infrastructure's changed and nobody's mapped it, and what have we got? And and most of this is, I'm more concerned about driving more circular economy materials and doing more with them in your economy. That's an economic regenerative opportunity, and that needs a strong private sector focus. My problem comes when we take residual waste, which is frankly of no value to anybody. It's a problem. We have a problem to get rid of it safely, to stop it impacting on human health and the environment. And then we let very large corporates come along and make a mint out of resolving that problem, because we're too afraid to come up with the strategic solutions and tell people, this is residual waste, this is what you're going to do with it. So I would put residual waste into a special category, and it would be directed waste. And you're then able to strategize solutions for that. And then let slightly more free market solutions evolve for the management of the circular economy value journey, but still try and maybe prescribe some of that so that you get sensible solutions out of that, and you encourage solutions in the right areas of material policy. For example, we should have had a network of solutions that were proximate to the residual waste. So residual waste is not won by a large corporate and then moved vast distances, and this waste is crossing in the middle of the night on a road somewhere. That is just carbon and cost inefficient. So I would have been much more centrally planning some of those solutions. In the area of circular materials, I'm thinking, and we were doing work on critical minerals and critical metals way back in SEPA days with the United Nations. We know that we have got to conserve these raw materials. They are, in some cases, getting increasingly rare, but we don't have the systems to keep them within our economy. So quite often we'll take materials, we'll get them recovered, and we'll send them abroad to somebody else who's been smart enough to set up the technology to actually recover those minerals, and they go, now we own them, thanks very much, Britain, for giving them to us, you thick so-and-sos. You want to drive your own economy, get your circular economy, keeping the resources in your own economy, and use these resources to the maximum potential you can.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? You want local solutions and be able to deal with everything within, at least within Scotland or within England or within the UK. What about the worst thing you've ever done in terms of a job, or any disasters in the waste industry? Any funny stories, John? You must have plenty, I'm sure. Not disasters, obviously, but funny stories.
No, funny story. You always, every recycling officer's got a funny story, and most of them will have heard this one. But I do remember a woman losing a wedding ring, and she was, distraught, as you would imagine. And I could just feel the woman's pain. And I called up the depot, and it was in some particular bank from some particular part of Perthshire, rural Perthshire. And we were able to isolate the rough area it had been dumped. And 3 guys went in there and searched for 2 hours. And hey presto, they found her ring.
Oh, fantastic.
And she was so grateful and happy. I'll never forget that. But then at another point, I got a call one day saying there was a distressed mother at a textile bank on one of the sites who had put her child into the textile bank and couldn't get the child out. So you get these funny wee stories. And I suppose worst job in some way, if you describe it, and yet it was still a fascinating job, was early days. I thought, we're not going anywhere with recycling. This is the early 90s, 91, 92. So let's go and actually work out what's in our waste. And waste analysis was, and you'll appreciate this because you do so much of it. You do it, one of the best companies in Scotland doing it, was a very broad, you'd had to kind of come up with your own systems pretty much. The guidance was very, very thin on the ground. So I had a team of 6 workers, and we had metal grids and wheelie bins, and a ton of black bags turned up, and we spent 6 o'clock on a Saturday morning till 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning analysing this waste, and it was really, really interesting. But if you want to be sick, stick your hand into a nappy, pull out a dead rat wrapped in a condom on a Saturday morning. I'm telling you, I am exaggerating a little bit, but you get the drift,
Yeah, we've been there, John. We've seen them all.
Yes, you have.
I think our worst one was one of the sites where I think somebody had a half carcass of a deer or something in the bin that had been there for rather too long, and it was crawling with maggots. So it was like the inquiry to me was like, which category do we put the maggots in?
Oh. You learn a lot though by handling. You learn a lot by seeing waste, and I'm fascinated. I can't pass a skip. I cannot pass a skip without looking what is in here. Because you see all the forms of human consumption and all the materials of human consumption. Of course, it's changing and diversifying, and the one that's diversifying faster than anything else is plastic. So if you go to the Dusseldorf K events, which are every 3 years, I went to the first one in 2013, and then 3 years, 2016, 19. And if you imagine the NECC halls in Birmingham, the biggest hall there, multiply it 20 times, that's the size of this. And it's everything to do with plastic, including plastics recycling. And I came back and I wrote a report for Ian Gullins at Zero Waste Scotland after the 2019 event. And I said basically this, I said, plastics is evolving at least a decade ahead of the waste system's ability to manage the complexity of the materials presented and the issues they present. It's not just the different polymers, it's the inclusions in the polymers, the attachments to the polymers, and we've got to stay much faster in understanding the changes in materials that are coming into the global economy to be able to manage them effectively within circular economies. And that's a whole different conversation, a whole different journey of policy, working with industrialists, the petrochemical companies, the inventors of polymers. That conversation about what do we do with this once it gets out there needs to start then, and it doesn't, and it should be starting much, much earlier.
That's like with everything though, isn't it? Producers produce something and then leave it for everybody else to deal with. Yeah. So, it's like when we're talking about these waste upholstered domestic seatings, and then we've got plastic around cables. Do they contain persistent organic pollutants? Or, well, realistically, we should go back to the manufacturers and say, well, does it? But there seems to be something missing somewhere.
It's the horses bolted story again and again and again. We go, that's a great idea. We can make some money about that. Let's get that out there, and these consumers will buy it, and we're making it, and they're buying it, and they're, we've got a problem with this stuff. Well, we should know that before it gets out there, and we should have this. Either it's not allowed to get out there, and we're not perfect. We're not going to know that every time, but many times we know that there's a problem here.
It's like the biggest one's vapes, isn't it? I mean, I kind of switched on to it a bit more now, but crikey, that took a while it was so quick from coming in to selling as many as it did to realizing there was an issue.
It's almost a fact of life now that if you can make a fast buck doing something, somebody will make a fast buck doing it, and then we'll worry about the consequences after the event.
Yeah.
It's a pattern of human behavior.
So you mentioned there, John, you've been an environmentalist for lots of years. do you think your habits, your opinions have changed out with the workplace? Do you feel you have to engage with others and pass on your knowledge, or are you known as the eco warrior, or people just accept that now?
No, I think people know, that's what I do, that I care about it. I think it's important, that I've done it for many years because it is important. It's actually in some ways, it's quite a depressing career because you're doing something because there's no choice. I mean, we've only got one world at the moment to live on. And I wish everybody understood, and it was innate to human behavior that we have to tread carefully. And I look around the world and I see people, just, dancing through the meadow with a bulldozer and not really understanding it, not conscious that we live in a closed ecosystem and that sooner or later, the kiln jar full of bacteria having a party on sugar is going to come to a crushing realization that you can't do that without understanding the limitations. So it's in some ways it's quite a depressing career. I would be quite happy making kids' toys out of wood and writing poetry or digging my garden. But it matters that much that I think a lot of people are really committed to continuing to do their very best to the very bitter end of their ability to keep promoting the message, to keep trying to find the innovative ways through to changing behavior, to finding new systems, to just turning the direction, turning back the tide, because that's what it feels like at the moment. It feels a bit like King Canute on the beach.
Yeah.
It does seem quite depressing. There does seem to be a bit of a backlash towards anything environmental at the moment. There does seem a bit, and I think the sort of fake news agenda does seem to be driving. I was talking recently to somebody who I previously thought was fairly sensible, and they were saying that the recent floods in Dubai were due to the Saudis seeding the clouds. That's the conspiracy theory that's going around the internet, that it was they were doing it themselves. It was nothing to do with the fact that our sea's warmer and the atmosphere soaks up more moisture, and therefore you've got more floods.
Yeah, the internet's uncanny ability to steal people's minds and get them to believe any old nonsense. And woke used as a pejorative these days makes me wince, because I'm just thinking, here's another person that's been radicalized online and is fast asleep most of the time. And I think for the environmental denial that we have a problem, it's simply, in some respects, it's a response to helplessness. If I believe this is not a problem, the problem goes away because it doesn't exist. Yeah. So I can imagine the problem away by denying it. And if I then go and promote that, I'll persuade some other poor fool to do the same thing. And before you know it, you've got a whole mass movement of people who are just, not at all concerned by what's happening.
I think it's like, oh, well, the only way I can change this is by changing my behaviour, and I can't be bothered because I'm quite happy doing what I'm doing. It's people, again, it's every little helps, doesn't it? But
And to some extent, I count myself also partly responsible, because I am not perfect in my own behaviour, because it's difficult in a system which makes it so hard to be reducing your footprint in every different way. I still drive a car; it still puts out emissions from diesel. Why haven't I given that up? Because I can't get to work if I don't. It's so difficult, and I go, we should all be doing so much more, and that includes me.
Mm-hmm.
I think going on holidays is the important one for me.
Well, I was going to say, we're not talking about Jane's holiday. She just had another flight for the year. I was going to say, John, that a lot of the logic for us doing this podcast was about my sort of frustration that I always feel that the waste industry is very good at talking to the waste industry, but actually not very good at talking to the wider world about how complex some of this is. And that's what we're trying to get across, get all these different people that are involved in the sector and explain what they do to try and get a bit of that message out there. So anyway, next one I've got for you, how do you get away from the work, or do you ever get away from the work?
My wife would probably say not. I have a wife I met at school. I've known her for 50 years now, actually.
Oh,
I haven't been
wow.
married for 50 years, but she's still my best friend. Makes me laugh almost every day of my life. I gardened, so I'm really keen. We have an allotment, and when the season starts, that's just, if I've got a spare minute, that's where I go, because it's very de-stressing. It's very good for your immune system. It's very good for your mental health. And the allotments in Dunkeld have the most beautiful community of people, and I count each one of them and almost as a family. And I'm also a Christian, so I'm an elder at the kirk in Dunkeld, and that's a very foundational thing for me. In an age of secularism, and a lot of people don't like the idea of believing in anything religious, but for me it's very important. So it's a metronome of my purpose, and it regulates my behavior. At least I want it to regulate my behavior in good ways. So yeah, those are the things that keep me sane, I think, and I'm grateful for them, because I think a lot of people are really struggling in this age, post-COVID, post-cost of living, and it's very difficult to be conscious in this world and not suffer when you see the terrible things that are done to women around the world, and the war in the Middle East, and the terrible things being done to Palestinians and to Israelis, and poverty and migration. It's difficult. It's really difficult not to be upset. So I'm grateful for the things that keep me calm.
Yeah, I like the idea of the allotment. I'm not quite sure whether I'd actually, I like the idea, whether it's the theoretical side of it, but with the actual organisation side of it, and dig in's my thing. But what do you grow, John? I love a
What do we
allotment.
grow? Well, we have a polytunnel and a greenhouse. So we grow tomatoes, we grow aubergines, cucumbers.
Wow.
We grow basil and various herbs. We grow potatoes and cabbage and kale and carrots and lettuce.
Blimey.
And we have a fig tree, we have blueberries, and we have strawberries, and we have plums, and goodness, I've got a few other things that I've probably missed out. We grow squash, grapes.
Crikey, that must be quite a big allotment, John, or is it just everything's quite fitted in quite well?
We have actually, we've kind of inherited two allotments together, and one of our partners, who was, the other part, is very old and retired. So we just manage that part for her and take her a bag of crops when there's times that actually there's times during the summer when everything on the plate came out of the allotment. That's the most satisfying meal of the year for me.
Yeah, we used to, when I was growing up, we had a big garden. My dad was a big gardener of vegetables and all this sort of stuff. That's why I like the idea of it, but I didn't actually quite realise how much effort he put into it. I remember starting off and having a wee vegetable plot and thinking, crikey, I'm going to have to weed this. The plants don't just grow on their own.
I used to be quite good with my garden, actually. I used to have a greenhouse and a garden, and I always remember the neighbours' kids. You'd give them a tomato and they'd be like, "Oh, I don't like that taste of a tomato," and it's like, of course I do taste a tomato, but it's just always, everyone's always a bit sharper from the garden, isn't it? It's always got a better taste.
It tastes better. And it's very interesting, because years ago, in the early 90s, I started working, and there was an old man, a retired mineralogist, geologist, who said, he called me at the council. He says, "Mr. Ferguson, my name's Robert Robertson was his name. He's an old retired, polymathically lovely man, long dead now. There's something very interesting going on with this basalt rock dust in soil remineralization, and you need to check it out. I go and check it out." So I did. I duly did, and I met Cameron and Moira Thompson. Cameron and Moira Thompson started the Sear Centre, and by this point, I'd kind of got to know them, and I'd moved into SEPA, and at SEPA I was able to get them some grant funding to set up the Sear Centre up in north of Pitlochry on the Mullen Moor. And if you drive up from Pitlochry over to Bridge of Cally to this day, about 3-4 miles outside Pitlochry on the left-hand side, you'll see this sudden verdant, fecund area of growth in the middle of this moorland. You go, that is really strange looking. That is rock dust and compost and soil fertility. Now, the current chief executive of the James Hutton Institute is a guy called Colin Campbell. Really good guy. So really great people. Derek Stewart over in the James Hutton Institute. To this day, Colin Campbell was at the Macaulay Land Use Research Institute at the time. Anyway, he was one of the institutes up in Aberdeen before the James Hutton Institute was formed. And we commissioned him from SEPA, Jane, to do research. to try and find out what the science behind rock dust was. How was it behaving? How was it doing this in soil? Because we knew it did something. We were pretty certain it was capturing carbon. And of course, one of my teams was the first carbon team in SEPA, and the clean technology team. And I was very interested in this rock dust stuff. Anyway, we just couldn't get the evidence. Kept coming back saying, "Oh, there's nothing happening here." And I said, "Well, you say that scientifically, but I can see it empirically." And empirical science or empirical, evidence is a very important driver for find the reality of the evidence. Anyway, fast forward to about 2018, and Sheffield University published a paper that found the root of carbonation driven by certain minerals within the basalt. And they reckon that for every ton of basalt used, you may be locking up 400, 500, 600 tons of carbon dioxide. And that was a hey presto moment. And out of that, you've got companies like Undo.
I was just going to mention them, John.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then more recently, Veolia. And the minute I saw Veolia getting into this, I thought this is about to mainstream.
Yeah.
So we're in discussion with Veolia, interestingly and separately, about just what they're doing and a few other things we could maybe bring to that party. But what's interesting, mostly for me, about the rock dust is, yes, it could lock in carbon, and that's hugely important. But it's putting the minerals back into the food chain. Because functional medicine says what's causing this problem. A lot of allopathic medicine is what's the symptom, there's a pill, there's a solution to your pain or your problem, but it's not getting to the root cause. And at the foundation of functional medicine is healthy soil and healthy food, and a really strong diet. Food is your first medicine.
I always remember Charles Gray, who runs a composting facility up in the northeast coast. So he's a potato seed exporter. So he grows seed potatoes for exporting around the world. And he used to apply shellfish to the land as a fertilizer. And then various reasons, animal byproduct regulations came in. He had to stop doing that. So he started an in-vessel composting to make compost and put it to land. And his thing very quickly was yes, there was a benefit from the nutritional value, the potassium and the nitrogen in the compost, but he was all as convinced right at the start that the other value was just the effect on the soil structure and the improvement in the soil structure, all that sort of stuff you couldn't quite quantify and couldn't measure, if you like.
Yeah.
But he recognized pretty quickly that he got a huge benefit from his crop because using compost, and it wasn't just down to the nitrogen and potassium and all the other things we measure. It was due to the soil structure.
Yes.
Well,
it does.
I mean, we worked with Undo, who do that basalt dust, and when we first started working with them, I was reading it thinking, this is absolutely quite fascinating. How does it work? It's like you're getting into the science of it, and I'm a geologist. And I was thinking, right, okay, how does that work? How do we get the basalt? Where does it come from? Where does the dust have? How does that get mixed? It was quite, it was quite fascinating actually. How much do you add? Yeah.
And it's interesting. It's ubiquitous in the rock formations almost around the world. So everywhere can find basalt. And the idea, Hamaker's book, "We Mineralize the Earth," published, I don't know when it was published, sometime in the 70s, I think, was the seminal tomb. Cameron Moira Thompson, Cameron Thompson now sadly dead, and Moira's still living up in on the Mullamoor, north of Pitlochry at the Sear Centre, but unable probably to maintain it. They were the pioneers, and you had a group called We Mineralize the Earth across in America, Joanna Camp. These are people that have been on this journey for 30 years, never lost faith. And now the science is catching up with their empirical understanding. And we could significantly repair global soils in fertility terms and in the ability to lock up carbon. And it could be a massive driver for carbon sequestration in the future. And it mustn't be destroyed by the kind of jump on the bandwagon, let's get lots of carbon credit money for doing dodgy things, because that happens every time we've got a way of getting carbon out the atmosphere.
Well,
The MRV, the kind of MRV processes that allow us to validate that's a genuine ton of carbon taken and it's genuinely stored there and it really works and it's honest and there's the evidence. It all hatches on that so that the fraud stops, because criminals hover around this space like flies around, and I won't say honey.
Right, moving on. So I'm going to go back a bit. We talked about it at the beginning about your current role. You know, you've kind of seen your 14 years of work culminating in the energy from waste facility. What about what's next for you? What are you looking at? What's your next project or your next task or challenge, John? Apart from your garden and your allotment.
I'd like to see the Eco Park come to fruition, just as a demonstration of, you know, it was interesting to listen to Liz Truss talk about, you know, growth, you know, during that episode of her short political career. And I thought, yeah, but what kind of growth are we talking about? If it's more of the growth that I think you're talking about, it's more of the growth that's causing the problem. At what point do we understand that you can't keep growing an economy based purely on consumption because of the consequences of consumption and the emissions of consumption and, you know, the waste related of components of consumption? You know, so how do we find, and this is challenged, and you know, you get some fascinating conversations with Simon about this one. Simon Glenn, you know, how do you drive a regenerative economy? We need economies that are regenerative, that are productive, that give people employment, that give people a good standard of life globally. They give people clean water and enough food to eat and decent shelter. How do you drive those economies? And I just find that very interesting. And one of the things I'd like to do is to show how industrial ecology, which is that making the right transition to the right technologies and techniques and connecting them in more efficient spaces and places. And, you know, because the themes of the Eco Park are circular economy materials, so driving further into material recovery. And we're building, you know, a brand new fridge plant. It will be one of the cleanest, most modern fridge plants in the world when gap recycling come to the bin. So circular economy materials. And then another critical issue, given that we are an agricultural platform in a rural space with a lot of free heat, is controlled environment agriculture. So how do we drive more self-sufficiency in our food systems, more resilience in our food systems as a climate change adaptive measure, and how do we drive carbon out of the food distribution system by producing more food closer to home? And this is a transition that every country in the world needs to make after this recent cost of living crisis, after seeing the vulnerability of global food supply chains. So that's two very fundamental themes: is circular materials, because we need materials for any kind of economy, and we need to eat. So the third theme is our renewable energy platform. And there we've got the wind farm, we've got solar with planning permission, we've got hydrogen with planning permission, we've got batteries with planning permission. We have an active AD system producing energy from biogas. And we've now got an 8 megawatt thermal energy platform with 17 megawatts of heat. It's one of the most integrated renewable energy platforms anywhere in Britain. And it's all there to use to drive the local economy on the site. And in some cases, we might distribute energy to nearby, you know, places. If we can get the energy market working constructively to do that, that would be helpful. So I'd like to finish that. I'm very involved. I was one of the kind of people that was pushing for all of the clean growth projects in the Tayside deal. Things like the Eden project at St Andrews, the James Sutton Institute's work on various things, Perth West Eco Innovation Park, the Binn Eco Park. Within the Tayside deal, I have a project for about 5.2 million awarded, going through that process of getting that funding to build an advanced plastic separating and upcycling factory. And that's all about decarbonising incineration, as we talked about before. So I'm very involved in the regional economy. You know, I can't do much at a global level. Although my daughter works for the United Nations in environmental work, as a marine lawyer. So, you know, we need to work with our global institutions, but I think I can work best at trying to demonstrate what can happen at a regional level. And let's grow a regional economy that's smart and regenerative, and you know, looking at the adaptations and the mitigations for what is coming, you know, without doubt. So how do we secure the essentials of our existence? Difficult, but that's what I'll do for the next 5 years at least.
Crikey, that's a big ask, John. I think, yeah, well, good luck if you can do all that in 5 years. But at least you can leave us a legacy there for somebody else to take on your mantle. I hope you've got somebody else coming up behind you to keep going with all of this.
Oh, there's always another generation of really great people. I mean, you mentioned Arena Brown earlier, so there's a good example. There's a lot of really good young people coming into a whole range of different environmental domains, Jane, I think, and the waste sector needs to perhaps tell its story a bit better about how exciting an industry it is, because I think a lot of people think waste management is emptying bins, and it's just this tiny little start of a very fascinating journey for materials.
Yeah, it is. What about a fact? We've kind of, I think we've kind of done lots of facts and different facts, but have you got one you'd like to share from your job or your sector which you think people might not know and that they should know about? Anything specific?
I think this is something that came out and it really struck me. You'll know that we set the Resource Management Association in Scotland up. And a few people will know the history, but I had 2 attempts at SEPA to do something to get the ESA to, broaden its membership, and another attempt, and this time with Nikki in 2015, and then kind of late 2018, early 2019. I went back to Nikki and said, look, we've really got to do something because we have no representative body at all, and we need to get something, set up. And we were successful, and largely due to people like Alan McGregor and Drew Murdoch and Brian Ritchie and others in the sector that said, okay, we'll do it as operators. We need this, and they did. They got right behind it, and then we started to get that diverse community of circular economy, resource management, getting engaged, operators and niche companies and consultancies, and got some really great members. We started to grow the membership, and then we decided to do a bit of work on what is the strategy for the sector. And the first thing that we did was analyze what all of the different industry sectors in Scotland needed. And Nikki, in her indomitable style, and there's nobody better to go out and get people sat down and saying, what's wrong here? What do you need? To engage with stakeholders. She's absolutely brilliant at it. She really led that work, and Duncan Simpson helped. I did a little bit of work, but Nikki did most of it. And what it taught me was the waste sector touches every single industrial sector and every single part of society. So every household, every person, every business. And I don't think we fully appreciate the power of that network, what we can influence and what we can support and what we can do. And I think if we start to really understand that one fact, we'd go, we are a very powerful sector.
Absolutely. You need to have a wee chat with Nikki. We've been trying to get Nikki in the podcast for a while, and she's a bit elusive.
Well, she's
everybody keeps talking at this elusive Nikki character.
A pretty gentle and pretty shy character, but she's got a lot to say. She's a very smart woman.
We'll keep trying. We'll get her on one time.
I'll have a go. I mean, one of the real pleasures of my career at this stage, because I'm already past retiring age, but no intention really of retiring because there's still too much to do, is the joy of working with people like Nikki and Duncan Simpson and yourselves. There's some professionals in this in Scottish sector that. It's just a privilege to be able to work with them. Nikki's definitely one of those people. Simon Glenn, another. There's some really great people.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Absolutely. So, a favourite piece of slang or dialect in your, not necessarily your workplace, it could be anything in your general life.
This is one that I wish I'd thought of a little bit more holistically about, Alistair. I can't think of one coming off the top of my head, and I wish I had one. Maybe by the end of the podcast in a few minutes.
You might come up with one. Come up with one. So while you're thinking about that, then we'll give you a magic wand to do something in the waste industry. I think you've probably given us the answer to this already, but what one thing would you like to use it for?
Well, I mean, part of is decarbonising incineration. That would be definitely one of the things. But if I was to be more egalitarian and internationalist about it, it would be that there was no jurisdiction in the world that didn't have the resources to implement a proper resource management strategy and create the economic benefits of this for their own economies and for the benefit of their own environment, because they would be protecting their environment significantly.
There you go.
Okay, that sounds like a good one.
A much needed one. I
Yeah.
always say to students when I'm lecturing at university that, you know, in some ways, if they want to get involved in waste management and make a big improvement, you know, the place to do that is in the developing world. You know, because there's so much needing done.
So much resources needed, isn't there? Help needed.
There's lots needing done here, but there's huge amount of help needed in lots of parts of the world in terms of waste and resource management.
I'll give you a little piece of, not slang, but just an expression that just came to mind actually. It's a truism in life, and it's manners maketh man. That was a quote by William of Wykeham in 1297. And this idea that, you know, kindness and gentleness and good manners take you a long way in life, that violence and aggression and rudeness, and particularly this keyboard warrior tendency to threaten this and threaten that, particularly when they're threatening women, I just find that the height of cowardice, the height of weakness. And I think strength comes out of gentleness, strength comes out of kindness, and good manners cost nothing. So that's maybe a motto for living.
No, that's good. That's good.
Yeah,
I like that.
I would agree with that. So finally, what advice would you like to give the younger generation coming into this sector? Because, you know, like you said, we've got some really good young people kind of coming up, but we need more. How do we show them that waste management is such a interesting, exciting sector that, you know, is worth a second look?
I think highlight, showcase good projects, things that are making a difference. This makes a difference. This makes a difference. It's back to this operationalization of policy. I mean, for all the interest in the use of knowledge and information, if it sits in a book or in a page, it's doing nothing. You know, when it goes to work and it changes something. So, you know, show them what happens when ideas become real and make a difference. That instantly motivates people. And mentoring is important, I think. Passing on knowledge, passing on enthusiasm, passing on vision. You know, we've all got a responsibility to do that. And I think in some ways that's what your blog's doing. And I commend you for that.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think we've exhausted our list of 11 questions, Jane, not 20.
Sorry.
Well, I think it was probably about 120 by the time we added a few extra.
It was a very relaxed and lovely conversation. And if anybody's listening to this, I hope they're not bored to death.
I'm sure they'll not. So thank you very much, John, for being so generous with your time and your thoughts and ideas. Lots of good stuff. I was aware of some of the things you were talking about, but you know, lots of good stuff in there. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, John. Much appreciated. Good to talk to you again.
Very welcome. And thank you, and I commend what you've done with all the people previously. I'll go and listen to some of them now. Thank you.
In the heart of air where the echoes ring, there's a place that fights the chaos out beyond it sings. They're the warriors for the earth, fighting every day. An environmental consultancy leading the way. They train the fighters, they sharpen the blades, battling the waste that pollutes and degrades. With knowledge as their weapon, they educate and train. I'll be on environmental, breaking the chain. From the mountains to the seas, they spread the call, aiming for a future where the world will not fall. With sustainability as their creed, they march on. I'll be on environmental, a battle cry.